Welcome to Thoughts on Change, the podcast about the messy, political, emotional, deeply human side of leading change. I'm Kelly, and I believe anyone can implement lead tools until they actually have to get people to use them. Around here, we talk about how to move culture, how to build credibility, and how to influence without bulldozing. Basically, how to herd humans without losing your mind. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this very special episode of Thoughts on Change. I'm really excited for this conversation because I've brought two people on that I admire a great deal, Mark Rosenthal and Laurel Martin. I'm going to have them introduce themselves really quickly, but we just came from the Kata and TWI summit together and had some wonderful conversation. And I thought, why not actually sit down and hit record and share these amazing thoughts from these wonderful people. So, Mark, Laurel, please go ahead and give yourselves an introduction.
Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, I'll go. So, hi, my name's Mark Rosenthal. I've been in Kata land since the book was published, in 2010 or so. Blogged about it a lot on theleanthinker.com. I've been speaking at every Kata summit since KataCon 4. We just had 12, so you can do the math. Also a co-founder of Kata School Cascadia. We put on cool learning events and get together every Friday.
Right. I'm Laurel Martin, longtime fan of Mark Rosenthal. So it's an honor to be on this podcast together. I'm an operational excellence and organizational development consultant, independent. And, I help companies who are feeling the strain, try to figure out, what is that bridge between the process stuff and the leadership development stuff. So this topic is near and dear to me, especially, a conference that brought together TWI and Kata, and how those merge together, and really emphasize the role of people in having an impact from any of our efforts.
Awesome.
I'll just add that thinking the history before there was a KataCon, a couple of years before that, I got asked to kind of do, hey, what's this Toyota Kata thing, to the TWI summit. So actually, I may have introduced the audience to it in a way. I mean, obviously people knew what it was and they were curious. And that was just kind of an overview of the mechanics. And, I went last because no one knew who I was. And it was, it was an interesting time meeting the TWI community. That was the first time I really got to know them.
Wow. That is interesting. It's opening up a question for me about when did the conferences, right? Originally it was KataCon, and then it changed to Kata and TWI Summit, which is where we came from. And we will go through what is Kata, what is TWI, just in case. But first, I want to land on this question. Mark, do you know, when did that transition happen and why did it happen?
Well, that goes to the whole business model, I suppose. But so again, I remember the years. We can do the math, whatever. So the first KataCon was just that. It was a Toyota Kata standalone summit. I think it attracted, it was over 100 people. Don't think they broke 200, but it was a pretty big room. A lot of people from Europe, because in reality, the initial research was done in Germany. And if you look in the pictures in the book, in the original book, you can see the storyboards are actually in German. But there was a consultancy called, what were they called? W3 Consulting that really, I think, was the prime. Most of the speakers were their clients and most of the presenters were their people. But that was a community coming together for the first time. And that was kind of the vibe on that one. And it went through as a standalone, and, just logistically, Lean Frontiers began running them sequentially in the same week at the same venue with TWI Summit. I'm going to say that was probably, so the third one for sure in San Diego had the TWI going on, I think at the same time. But what happened after 2021, which was a virtual conference, is that the attendance never really came back. And Last year, for a couple of years, they were running them in parallel. So you could flip back and forth, but there was still a distinct room talking about kata and a distinct room talking about TWI and some joint things. And then last year, I think was the last time they did that. And then this year, they just mashed the two together into a single conference.
Yeah. Interesting history there. And I'm sure, we could have a whole conversation about the lean conference industry. So we'll kind of stay away from that a little bit. But to come back to, right, what are these two concepts? So let's do a quick check-in, because some of my audience might know, some of them might not. So let's talk about what is kata, what is TWI. So I'll give a quick, right, kata is just a word that means like a routine that we practice to learn a new skill, often associated with martial arts. So for anybody who has seen Karate Kid, that's always the reference that is used. When Daniel-san is waxing the car, painting the fence, painting the floor, all of that is a kata. And so we use this pattern to develop the habits of scientific thinking that were developed from Mike Rother's original research in Germany in 2009. At least that's when the book came out. So then TWI, training within industry, whole nother section of work from World War II, I believe. And I'm going to ask both of you to help fill in the history gaps here. 3 sections of TWI, right? JR, job relations, which is how to help and support people. Job methods, how to improve work. And then job instruction, which is how to document and train in those processes. So please, Laurel, Mark, what are your thoughts about the two concepts, and what else would you add to, their definitions for our listeners? Laurel, why don't you get us started?
Sure. I would say I learned a lot about the historical arc of these practices from Mark's talk at the conference, and really showing this interplay where it wasn't just like Toyota came up with lean in a vacuum, right? There has been this back and forth development, with lots of different countries involved. But if you think about the role of TWI, if people don't know on the call, that was started really in response to World War II and this need to drastically ramp up production while all the soldiers were going off overseas. So who's going to be left in our factories? People who've never worked in factories before. And so, it was a quick and effective way to get people to do the jobs safely and conscientiously that they had had no prior exposure to, while also keeping people on board. So it couldn't be purely mechanistic, like, okay, just, work harder, work faster. But how do we engage people as humans and, enrich their skills? And of course, that's good for the company. And it was interesting to see all the threads that Japanese companies picked up after the war when we're like, hey, this was kind of helpful for us. Do you want to try it too? And then kind of seeing where that's landed in modern lean, and kind of pulling back through like, oh yeah, that kind of came from JM or that kind of came from JR. So I like that it's always, it's talking about these conferences. I feel like this community has always been very collaborative, and like we grab a book and we're like, okay, let's all go try this out and see what we learn and see what happens in real life when we take these concepts and try them out. And it's all an experiment, right? Coming back to kata, how do we discover our way into a better method? And I feel like we do that on ourselves in this practice. So I think they pair really well together, because kata is all about how do you methodically improve, or how do you methodically solve a problem? How do you actually work through that? Applied very, very broadly, like to pretty much any goal you have. TWI gives us this great background of, well, then how do you kind of shore up, the standard work that you discover in your kata practices? And how do you relate to the people who are absolutely essential to actually doing the kata, discovering change, adopting change, sustaining change, which is, a lot of the themes we talked about.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that, Laurel. Mark, I'd ask, what would you add? And especially, right, what are you learning about and kind of exploring with what is the purpose of kata? What is it really for?
So I think the way I'm looking at it is there's an underlying thinking pattern that's behind everything, all of these things. And, we call it PDCA, we call it scientific thinking, we call it applied problem solving. It has lots of names. But it is the thinking process of methodically saying, what am I trying to get done? Where's the gap? And then, okay, what do I need to try in order to figure out how to close that gap? And so the kata structure, just to be clear, Toyota Kata is really designed to create an environment where people learn to think that way. And so it's a structure for the coaching conversations so that the learner begins to think that way. But that's an underlying general model of just good thinking. If I applied that general model of just good thinking to, hey, my problem is my people are all inconsistent about how they go about doing this job, I will end up developing something that looks a lot like a training system. And an instance of that training system is what we call job instruction. If I had to go methodically around how do I save time, I end up developing job methods. And job relations, the pattern's exactly the same. The words are different. Kata has iteration built in. It's only implied in job relations, but job relations is from the 40s. So I look at the TWI things, I guess, or programs as specific skills applied to specific contexts that at the time it was developed, those were the problems that needed to be solved to get more airplanes out the door. And it was a very narrow focus to solve that one problem. Nowadays, we have scoped back a bit, and I think we have to be careful to make sure that what we're applying to our context, when we're applying it to our context, that the context that it was developed in actually applies to the problem, or we modify a bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point about context, because these two methods come from historical situations, different cultures, different environments. And I think that was the common thing that I certainly heard happening at the summit, was just what is the modern context? What are we, how are these evolving into what we use now and today, and how is our understanding of them evolving? And I'd love to hear from both of you, what did you take away from that perspective? How are you seeing these evolve? We can rock, paper, scissors on who gets to go first.
Well, maybe I'll just share one of my key learnings from each of you, because honestly, you guys kicked off the conference, and it was like within the first, 40 minutes, I had so much learning. I was like, how am I going to fit any more in my brain? But one of the points that Mark really made is that leaders create the conditions for any of these things to succeed. So you can be, total expert at any of these models and have perfect rationale and all the results and proof points you want. It's not going to work if you can't engage the people who actually have to try it and have to, change their behavior, change their processes to get different results. So that really resonated, this idea of leadership doesn't happen in the leader's mind. It happens in the reaction in the minds of those being led. And so we have to be really conscious about where they're coming from. And this kind of merges in the key point that I took away from you, Kelly, which is before we try to bring our method, whether it's any of these things, Kata, JR, JI, JM, we have to think about what is their story? What is their lived experience right now? What challenges are they facing? What are they up against? What are their hopes? What are their fears? And really get in and adapt. That's where I think the core skill comes in now for Kata and TWI practitioners. How can you adapt to that story, that situation, and add, just the right kind of nudge, I think is the word you use, Kelly, to kind of infuse this type of thinking into the way work is done, without, coming with the full toolkit and all of our perfect, the way we've learned to do it by the book, but really adapting to that human story that's unfolding right now.
Mark, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So, gosh, I was listening carefully and forgot the question. But
hey, you can just respond to what Laurel said too. That's fine.
I can too, actually.
Yeah. The theme that developed was it's about leadership development. And it was cool because that was my message. But what I saw was most of the other speakers were the same. Um, and that was cool. Um, but some of the other things that I just gonna go through some of the notes, and maybe this is a non sequitur, I don't know. But one of Mike's research questions, right? Yeah, that was it. Let me back up. Um, one of the things is that the J programs were developed as specific scripts for specific instructors to teach specific skills. And where Toyota Kata came from was answering the couple of questions around. We have this company in Japan, which certainly in the early 2000s, in the late 90s, was a benchmark for improvement. And what are they doing that's different? Because the rest of us try to do it and it doesn't work very
Mm.
well. So the one of the Toyota Kata questions that Mike was trying to answer was, what are Toyota's unseen managerial routines that enable them to be far more successful with this? I'm paraphrasing. I would even change the word because it's the unseen leadership routines.
Mhm.
How do they lead their people? But then the I wrote down on my notes, okay, when we're looking at our own organizations, what are our
Mhm.
unseen managerial routines that are driving the results we're getting? And to be conscious of why we're getting the results we are, which is a whole kata thing. But I think that is something we kind of skip over as change agents, is we want to jump straight into, well, let's just start changing stuff, but let's understand what we're trying to change. And we all organizations have unseen managerial routines. That's the very definition of the culture of the organization. How do we respond to issues? What do those conversations sound like? And just becoming aware of that would probably be a pretty good first step if you're trying to create change.
Yeah.
I
Go,
think
Laurel.
that's the first step in Kelly's START model, which I really appreciated. I think the first S was like just systems, like look at how people are getting work done and communicating currently, and how are leaders showing up and interacting, and just what's happening there. Because yeah, before we try to change something, we should probably understand how it's working today.
Yeah. And I think, Mark, you raise a good point about this too, that I think we're pretty good as a community of, improvement people, that we do look at current state. Hopefully all of us most of the time. Hopefully more than most of the time. But it's really at that surface process level, which is good, right? We want to be looking at process. We focus on making process better and not just telling people to do things differently or harder or trying harder. But what we do miss is the leadership routines that you can't see that enable that current process to even exist right now. And it's that deeper dig that we're not very good at all the time.
Under Cheryl Jekyll, she brought up something, and I don't remember what she said. I just know what I wrote down is we need to map the flow of problems and problem
Mhm.
solving, as that is more important than
Mhm.
mapping the process, the industrial process or the work process. What happens when that process goes off the rails, when it can't be followed, when we encounter something that it doesn't account for? That process flow is really what defines those unseen managerial routines. What happens when there's a problem? If I were to go to, the Toyota automobile plant, it's really quick, right? That's that classic pull a rope and trigger a
Mhm.
light and start some music because I just encountered an obstacle on the assembly line. And that initiates a whole long chain of events to get that problem contained, understood, and solved. But we don't talk about that when we're looking at lean tools other than well, okay, but what happens next?
Mhm.
And what happens even when that light is out again? Because now we've at least restored the standard, but why did that happen to begin with?
Mhm. Yeah. And I appreciate the direction this conversation is going, which is, I had no path, but I love this point because I wonder, right? When I think about people who get into lean, continuous improvement, process improvement, a lot of the time it is engineers who are then trained on those process tools you talked about, Mark, right? We are taught how to analyze a process, right? Look at takt time, look at labor balance, look at defect rate and right defects per million opportunities. But we are not taught to see the conversations that happen in between. And they're, I think Toyota is a good example where those have become more visible. It's easier to see them happening. Where in a lot of organizations, I think that I know I've been a part of or, been to, it's really hard to see them. And it takes a lot of digging and listening to even identify what those processes are.
Yeah, I really loved how Cheryl Jekiel, it's who we're talking about, came in at the end of, she was like the very last speaker and gave us like all these tools or ways of making sense of some of these themes that we had been talking about, which is funny because I don't think she knew those were all the things we've been talking about. But she had a few really useful models. One is this iceberg map. And I know we have lots of versions of the iceberg map in the lean world, but this one was, the iceberg that we can see, or at least that we can measure, is the results. And that's what everyone wants, is like, okay, make my iceberg bigger. Right underneath the waterline are events, which are, you can think of as the things that we're actually doing, whatever, the Kaizen or the training. But underneath that are the patterns. And that's what we focus a lot on in Kata, is what are the patterns of kind of the thought process that we are really trying to ingrain in people, first through the start of Kata, then through, kind of letting people go and explore. But under that, we don't really talk much about what are the structures and what are the mental models. And it's really hard to ingrain a pattern if you don't change the mental model. And I think we often are like, oh, process leads to results, but it's actually like there's some deeper layers there before we can actually do that process in a authentic, deep and sustainable way.
Yeah, I like that metaphor. I use the same metaphor, and I says put those mental models, they're not even part of the iceberg. They're the water that holds up the iceberg. And that's why it's, I think, that that model makes it a little harder even to see that stuff, because we're paying all this attention to the ice.
Yeah, we're swimming in it. We can't even tell.
And it reflects Ed Schein's model of culture being the artifacts, the values, and the unseen or the unseen values, of the structures. And it's those underlying assumptions about what is true, which are the mental models, right? That really define what structures go into place, which then in turn drive how people behave. So that's part of it. And where the kata, just to kind of bring it back around, comes into the equation is changing those mental models to be more scientific, to be a little more, but also, okay, this is the whole leadership piece. I think what even in Kata land, what we don't do a good job of, except for some folks like Gemma Jones, is understanding empathy as part of that structure. We have to build it in, and at least I have to build it on purpose. And that's, coming back to Cheryl, she shared this thing that she called an empathy map. I haven't researched if that's hers or where it came from. But what I loved about it is if I look at a process that somebody's engaged in, even the problem solving process, what are they doing? What are they thinking? Okay. How are they feeling? And what are they saying to themselves or even to other people? And breaking down process steps. So let's just go back to the whole coaching kata thing, right? I mean, there's steps that the learner goes through. Have I, as a coach, deliberately designed the experience so that they are feeling like their confidence is building? Or have I somehow designed the experience where they're feeling like they're just going to have more stuff pointed out that's wrong? Been there, done that a long time ago. I was still
we
learning.
Probably all have. And to me, like for me, this all comes back to, a lot of space that I've been focusing on is how we, and I'm going to call like continuous improvement practitioners as well as part of this leadership group because, right, we are leading the way for demonstrating how change can occur and these methodologies. And I've been thinking a lot about, when we come into situations where we're asking people to change or asking people to think about doing work in a different way, we so often neglect all of that deeper human stuff that is happening. And we bulldoze in and we aren't taught to like pause and have a look at what is the current reality they're experiencing and feeling. And it becomes really hard to understand that because we only know our own experience. But I love what you said, Mark, that it's that deeper level of empathy to think about what might they be saying to themselves right now about this situation? How might they be feeling? And that's a whole part of the current condition that we need to be better about even contemplating before we push forward into situations, because I don't know, without a lot of conversation and building a lot of trust and relationship, I don't know that we'll ever be able to actually grasp it from somebody else's perspective. But even just thinking about it and considering.
I think that's really important because as change agents, and most of us are, most of them, I'm guessing most of the people listening to this are, we're really fond of making rollout plans, but that's not how change propagates. Change, and this is one of the notes I took, change spreads through relationships, not rollouts.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an organic social process. So we've got to engineer our understanding, engineer our process to simply deal with that as a fundamental truth. We're asking people to change how they interact with one another. We're looking at relationships, and we're looking at potentially changing the fabric of some of those relationships. And the people who are, was that one somebody said there is no resistance, there's simply ambivalence.
Mm.
And I like that better because nobody actively resists. They just, okay, this isn't, they don't get it yet or whatever. But people change their minds not as a result of some outsider coming in and giving a logical argument, but as a result of the people who are closest to them beginning to shift theirs. And so if we don't understand that social network, we're going to have a hard time creating the kind of change we have in mind.
You mean just more data doesn't do it? No, I agreed. Go, Laurel.
Oh, I was going to say that was the strongest theme for me as well, Mark. When we talk about leaders creating the conditions for change or change influencers, I think you use the word like, how do we pull people along with us or enroll them? How do we enroll people in wanting to follow us in the change, as opposed to, you will attend this Kaizen, you will write down your ideas on the Post-it, you will do the follow-ups. It runs so counter, that like the reality of the social situation runs so counter to how we had maybe been trained in lean, or what our leaders thought of us as, like, what's the role of the lean team or the continuous improvement director or the consultant, that we're almost all having to like unlearn these method driven, just get to the results through force and will kind of approach, and really understand, like, how do you develop trusting relationships through problem solving, which is part of why I just love the kata, because if you have enough of those conversations, it does that as a byproduct. But you can't mandate a different way of thinking or different assumptions or, the way someone's brain works. You've really got to cultivate those conditions over time and address that ambivalence. Like, well, what is great about the current way? What are you scared about with this new way? What might the implications be for your job or your reputation or, your role on this team? And how do you tap into that underlying, like, what do they really want from the change, and what would make it worth them, maybe taking some risks and participating in this thing? And it's not your agenda, it's got to be their agenda.
Yeah, and the whole process. What I said, and I just wanted to, I wanted to say it, is it's not even enrolling them to follow you; it's enrolling them to come with you.
Yeah.
And your alternative is compliance. And some people, will say, well, there are sometimes we just need to give orders. Okay, great. I understand that. But even compliance is a decision made by the person being led. So it's still on to them. There's nothing you can do to force someone to do something, even through threat of violence. They still decide to do it versus some alternative. So let's come back around. Enrolling them in your vision so they come with you is, it's probably harder to start that way. But if you want it to sustain when the, you know, you, when, yeah, if you want it to sustain, I'm just going to put it that way, when you're not there, when you're not watching, right? Leadership is expressed by what people do when the leader isn't there. That's a whole different ballgame. And, I love the story that David Marquet tells in his book, Turn the Ship Around. I'll put a plug in for that, where he's the captain of a submarine in the U.S. Navy, about the last place I would expect to let go of the classic give the order, I give the orders, you follow them structure. But in the last chapter, he is basically telling a story where everybody on the crew knew what to do, and they knew more about what was going on than he did. And what struck me about that story as a former military officer, so I obviously understood, the culture, was he stepped into the bridge, misread the situation, gave an order, and a junior sailor said on the bridge, "No, Captain, you're wrong." And to have a junior sailor call out the captain of the ship. But, what Captain Marquet did was he took a step back and realized that, yeah, that sailor was right. And the lesson he learned there was they got this, which is really cool. So that's what you want to create, right? Where, the boss doesn't have to have all the answers.
Yeah. And I think that comes back to this. It is about building relationships. It's about building a condition and experience for people. It's not about us coming in and saying, you're going to do it this way, or here's a tool, or here's a method. It is about that bridge and connecting to their emotional experience, their actual experience. It's hitting all the layers of that iceberg.
And creating those environment where people receive extraordinary support and are feeling that not just from the boss, but from their peers, from their teammates, from everybody around them. And that's what makes a championship sports team.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the oversimplification of this idea we have in mind that leaders get results through others. Like, okay, that's a little better than leaders get results by elbowing in and doing it themselves. But it's like, well, what is that chain? Because it's not just give order, the other person executes. So many things have to happen. To your point, Mark, we can't just compel people. Maybe occasionally we can threaten people and they do it. But so I've been kind of mapping that out of like, what is the chain from, okay, I hear that intent from the leader, if we want to put it in David Marquet's terms. And then I act in a consistent, aligned fashion with what that leader had in mind. There's a lot of steps in between to kind of unpack that I think, leader standard work and JR and all these things kind of help address. But yeah, it's a complex system to get from point A to point B.
So, Laurel, you're triggering one of my little JR rants. So
yeah,
forgive me, TWI gods. But one of my objections is that the language does reflect the attitudes of the times and of the 1940s. Plus, it reflects the problem they needed to solve. And that was not a problem of developing people. That was a problem of keeping them at work. It's a fundamentally different problem. And so I think that whole, gets results through people, but really the supervisor, in their words, doesn't get any results. The people get all of the results. The supervisor is responsible for making sure the environment is there, that the tools are there, that the knowledge and skills are there, such that the people are enabled to get the results that are needed. And so just looking at another piece, they say, good supervision is, I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't have my notes, but, a good supervisor uh, gets his people, their people, to do what he wants done, when he wants it done, the way he wants it done, because they want to do it, which just pushes me back. But really what we're doing is we want to enable people to do the right thing, to do it the right way at the right time. And that's a fundamentally, in my mind, fundamentally different attitude to bring in. So if I were to rewrite job relations, that would be one of the places where I would make a major change. I don't need to change the objectives of doing the right thing the right way at the right time. But I do need to say it's because we've created and enabled people to know what to do, know how to do it, and know when to do it. And that they're in an environment where they're supported to do those things.
Yeah, to develop their judgment and back them up.
Which going to bring us all the way back to, right, thinking about practitioners out there, leaders out there, right? I think the lesson, or maybe the message we're talking about a lot, is put the tools down. At least I'm going to say that. Put the tools down. Just stop. Put them down. And instead, think about what is that environment, and when a problem happens, map out instead, what do you want them to respond? How do you want them to respond? What does that look like? And then it is about, come back to where you are right now. What are your unseen routines, or maybe seen? There's probably a gap there. And then this is the beauty of PDCA and that thinking model. What's the next step to close the gap? And what's the next condition and experience you need to create to enable that team to move forward?
I hear people say if people would simply follow the standard work, which is yes. And so let's just say that your worker is doing their very best to follow the standard work, and then they run into something that stops them. What do you want to happen in the next 3 seconds? Because that is going to define whether or not you have standard work. Because, I have to work around the problem. Congratulations, there's no longer a standard. Or are they going to say, hey, we've encountered an obstacle, putting this in Kata terms, and then work together with that first responder? Okay, yeah, we're going to have to do the workaround to get things going again, but somebody knows, and we got to write it down and do something about it. If you want standard work to work, you have to be constantly looking for those sources of friction in your system and systematically honing your system so that those sources of friction are reduced or eliminated. Otherwise, the friction builds. And, one of my metaphors is we do a Kaizen, we do a classic 1-week Kaizen event. And what do we have on Friday is a target process that has not been robustly tested.
And a lot of to-dos.
Yeah,
big action list.
Yeah. and we have pizza and go home, and then Monday morning we start robustly testing it, whether we like it or not.
Mm-hmm.
So have we equipped those first line leaders, not with a long laundry list of stuff to do, but with the tools to know how to respond to those problems? And then it's just, here's the next obstacle, here's the next experiment. And so that's the difference, I think, between you can run a 1-week event. That's an awesome way to kickstart Kata. But my objective on those now is what I have at the end of the week is I have a functioning storyboard, and I have coaching cycles happening every day. That's, if you want change to sustain, you use the process improvement to stand up the conversation about process improvement. That's the objective.
Yeah. And this is now triggering maybe, I don't know if it's a new thought or it's just a thought that is finally forming into this way that routine, that scientific thinking routine that we call Kata, that practice is teaching leaders how to respond in the way that we want them to respond.
That's exactly what it is.
What we should be focusing on as a Kata, TWI, CI lean community is not what's the next tool I go implement, what's the next shiny new thing that I'm going to get these people to practice, but it's what are they doing right now to respond, and how can I shift that towards where we need to be.
It reminds me of Raghavan, because he quoted Peter Drucker, which is, anytime you quote Peter Drucker, you're probably doing some good thinking. But I love that only 3 things happen naturally in organizations: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Everything else requires leadership. And this is entropy wins, right? For those of us with any kind of technical engineering background, entropy wins every time. And we tend to think we can put in an improvement. And my metaphor is, okay, now the freezer's cold enough, we can unplug it. That's not going to work. You have to keep putting improvement energy in, even to keep it the same. And that's the leadership role, is to be conscious of those things that are adding entropy back to the system so that we can be actively removing it.
Yeah. I really like how you mentioned the importance of the first reaction in the 3 seconds, which, we've got to just train ourselves and practice. Like, okay, how do I want to respond when I notice the standard isn't being performed, or, whatever it is, and kind of modifying our idea of this, classic motivation theory of like, what are the positive and negative, immediate reinforcing consequences. It's kind of a version of that, but it's not like, oh, give them a pizza party when they do a good job. It's there's such a subtler way to reward almost the right thinking pattern that we want people to take, like when they encounter an obstacle or when they can't do the standard as performed. And I feel like often the leaders I observe are unintentionally giving reinforcement to things like complaining about the problem or taking shortcuts around the standard work, or whatever it is. I think of the classic, like, how do you sustain 5S? Well, no one should ever walk by a piece of trash on the floor without like picking it up, throwing it away, and maybe looking around to say, where did this come from? One theme I've been noticing, and actually a lot of different podcasts on different topics, like family and relationships and everything, is how do you rewire that first reaction to not be blame or defensiveness, but just curiosity? Like, I wonder why that standard work isn't being followed. And again, going back to, let me get the story from this other person whose mind I couldn't possibly pretend to understand. And let's see if we can unpack what's really going on there.
Yeah. Or even, I wonder why this person is so nervous, concerned about this change, instead of just immediately saying, oh, they're resistant.
Yeah.
They're an antibody.
Give them another presentation. Convince them harder.
But we do that, and we see that. Go, Mark.
Laurel, one of the things that is interesting, what's in it for them, right? We always like to ask that, but that right there is a transactional mindset. And we have to get away from the transactional mindset and get into a teaming mindset and get into a supporting mindset. It's not, what do I have to give them in order to get what I want?
Yeah.
Because the minute we're thinking in that transactional terms, we are moving toward compliance. And if you want true teamwork, you cannot rely on compliance to get it. So that compliance language is embedded in so many things that even those of us who like to think forwardly, we ask, well, what's in it for them? And the minute we do, we're asking, what do I have to give them to get them to do what I want? And that's the wrong question to ask.
Yeah, and I think that connects back to your, maybe modern critique of job relations. Is it doesn't feel copacetic with respect for people to say, well, our job is to get, the most activity or production or, compliance with this standard out of our people, but to make them think that it was their idea. It's like, well, that seems a little shady, actually.
I remember a presentation from a guy I heard years ago, and he was in the consulting business. You realize that empowerment means your people can make the decisions, right? Oh, I didn't say I wanted them to be empowered. I said I wanted them to feel empowered. And we have to be genuine, right? We have to be genuine, which means that there's a safety net, that there's no fear around bringing something up, about making a suggestion. Even And that's why we say in Kata, run the experiment, but keep the blast radius small. Make sure that the consequence of failure is relatively benign, and that we always have learning.
Yeah, I had a great Kata moment a few weeks ago, and we were just starting on a new challenge. And the leader actually volunteered to take the first step, like to implement the first experiment, which at first I was kind of like, oh, I don't know. Shouldn't you let your team step in? And then we come back the next day, what happened? How did it go? What'd you learn? And they said, I was going to try XYZ. Here's what I expected. And I was wrong. I was like, yes, round of applause. And it was such a perfect first experiment to have the leader say, it's perfectly fine. If you really think you're right, when you have your hypothesis going in, and then when we get back together, and you know what, it was super tiny. It was like, I don't know, I was going to go like try to fiddle with the design in this way and see if I could get this thing to fit. Or, and to just say, oh, I was wrong. No big deal. What's the next experiment? What do we need to learn next? So I really appreciated that for setting the tone of the rest of this kata, where now the team is running the experiments. I don't know if they did that on purpose, but
well, it doesn't matter. It happened.
It doesn't matter. Still for that safety.
And that's a great demonstration of the response that we want to instill, right? Whether or not that was on purpose or accidental, that's exactly what we're looking for. So amazing. Did you give that leader praise afterward?
I did indeed.
Good.
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So to wrap up the conversation, honestly, I could probably talk to both of you for a very long time about all of these things, but to honor and respect schedules and timing, I would love for us to just wrap up with, what is a single lesson, a single takeaway for our listeners, whoever they may be out there. What's the one thing that you want to make sure that they all leave with?
I think it is developing leaders. If you're not doing that on purpose, that you can end up with a rote process that nobody really mentally engages.
Yeah, and I'll steal one of your lines, Kelly. Okay, how do you go about that? Integrate, don't implement. How can we get into that? The mindset, the assumptions, the real, what do they care about? What would be a meaningful improvement here? And help them do what they already want to do versus saving the day with your tool they've never heard of.
And then they won't be able to actually sustain and use long-term because they don't understand and it doesn't make sense to their context. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and the second you walk away, that board's not getting updated. So
yeah.
I think one other piece, and I'm just going back to my notes from Cheryl Jekyll, effectively address lack of agreement. And yeah, that's a tactical thing, but that is one of the places, like one company that I think we all know well, and I'm not going to mention who it is, but that's one place where they don't do a good job. And it results in some frustration, and it's resulted in them being probably kind of stuck where they are for the last couple of decades. They've reached a level, they've plateaued because they haven't yet effectively addressed, or they're beginning to, that not every senior leader actually supports what it is they're trying to do. And that's a very common problem. I've seen it in almost every company. Well, certainly every company I've ever worked for had that problem of wanting to talk around disagreement or isolate the people who are disagreeing or whatever it is in an effort to mechanistically control that disagreement rather than organically address it. And having that mechanism of dissent, going back to David Marquet, how is it that you are encouraging people to bring up their concerns?
This is what gives me confidence that AI is never going to take over our jobs as change influencers, because it's that ability to productively surface the real, like, what are people really thinking and feeling here, and where are the disconnects? That's the magic of lean and getting these things to quote unquote work, is how do you move people into enough alignment over time that, we can move forward in the same direction.
Yeah. And this comes so beautifully together for like my big takeaway from this conversation, which is our jobs are to look at what are the systems and how are people responding and what is the ideal response we want in all of those situations. And that's what we need to slowly work on and shift in our organizations. It is not about go put a storyboard in place, go use TWIJI. It's okay, when this thing happens, how do I want people to respond to it? What does that look like? What does that sound like? And let's
Design
move toward
the
that.
experience that you
Yes.
want people to have, and you have to keep that in mind.
Yes. All right, Mark, Laurel, thank you both so much for coming on and spending time with me and having this really fruitful conversation. I am really grateful to both of you for everything I have learned from you two over the duration of my knowing you. And again, just really happy that you were able to come spend some time with us today. So thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity, Kelly. It's always fun to step back and learn even more from what you think you already learned by talking through it.
Always.
Yeah, thanks for putting this together. Made me go back and look at my notes.
There you go. All right. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. That's a wrap for this episode of Thoughts on Change. If you're also out there trying to move culture instead of just installing tools, hit subscribe and share this with a fellow CI warrior. And remember, progress beats perfection, curiosity beats control, and culture beats everything. See you next time.